Good morning, everyone. My name is Lena Schluchter. I'm the Women, Peace and Security expert at the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. And it is really a great honor to introduce this panel and moderate this panel today on such an important topic. As you know, historically, DDR programs have been designed for men, primarily at least, based on the assumption that it is men and boys who engage in war. Over the past years, however, the awareness has grown about the diverse role women play when associated with armed groups. So there is a bigger understanding now that, women play diverse roles such as combatants, support roles, wives of combatants, just to name a few. It is clear there is a need to understand more about the experiences of women associated with armed groups for their successful reintegration into civilian life. And while doing so, I think it is very key that we do not fall into gendered stereotypes, both about women and men, and about, have stereotypical assumptions about people's needs when they exit armed groups. So we also need to get better at understanding what the actual bottlenecks are for women and girls when they try to access reintegration programs. While applying a gendered approach to the full cycle of DDR, age-specific needs and considerations also need to be included. In a recent conversation, a colleague made me specifically aware about girls' access to education when exiting armed groups. And in addition, this colleague also underlined the importance of sexual and reproductive health care that should be part of any DDR program, both for women, men, boys, and girls. Finally, another important aspect that I just wanted to mention before I head over is how women transition or do not transition into formal political roles when their armed groups should decide to join a peace process. So I think we can sum it up that any person associated with an armed group combines many identities and experiences, and reintegration programs need to be tailored to these experiences and needs as much as possible, looking at the political, social, and economic reintegration together. I'll stop here and we'll hand over to our distinguished panel of experts and discussants. So we will start with Melisande Genat. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. You are a PhD student.
I just received my PhD.
Oh, congratulations. Wow. Okay, so congratulations. And you did your PhD in history at Stanford University. You're a researcher with MEAC Iraq UNIDIR, and your research focuses on state law and tribal justice in Iraq. And Melisande has been living and conducting research in Iraq since 2010. I'll hand over. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So yes, I focus on Iraq, and with IOM and then with MEAC, I've had the opportunity to look at obstacles to return and reintegration faced by families with oppressive affiliation to the Islamic State. And here I mean first-degree relatives of an ISIS member, so that's usually parents, spouses, children, and brothers, against whom there is no prosecution, usually. And for the past 3 years, I have been roaming the 3 Sunni provinces of Nainawa, Anbar, and Salahuddin. And that includes the camp, Jeddah 1 camp, to which families are being repatriated from Al-Hol since 2021. And because the focus at the moment for international organization is mostly on these 2 camps, I'll center my presentation on Jeddah 1 camp. And also because what people have told me there is consistent with all the stories that I've heard for the past 3 years across Iraq. And as in many post-conflict situations, there is a gender dimension that I think is important to consider when looking at obstacles to return and reintegration, especially as so many families in Jeddah 1 are female-headed households with children. So here are IOM figures. Out of 431 families in Jeddah 1 in February 2023, it's 304 families that are female-headed households. So in this presentation, I'll discuss some of the most pressing issues that are faced by these female-headed households. So in particular, the return requirements, access to civil documentation, and increased vulnerability to gender-based violence. So I'll start with return requirements. Before that. So this is a finding of a survey, a MEAC survey that was conducted last year, I think, in Genat 1 camp, and with people that had already left the camp. And of all the families with a perceived affiliation to the Islamic State that were surveyed, so in the camp and after they left the camp, female-headed households, they spent longer in Genat 1 camp. They faced higher barriers to return. They were more likely to face opposition to their return, and they were more likely to experience discrimination post-return. So I'll start with return requirements. These are the same for all Genat 1 camp residents, but female-headed households, they face more difficulties in completing all these steps. So the first type of return requirements is sponsorship. It can take different forms, but all Genat 1 camp residents are required to have a sponsor. Once they have obtained all the security clearance documents, the process to obtain these documents from Iraqi authorities is very opaque and it changes all the time, so I won't dwell upon this. But once permission to leave the camp has been obtained, they have to have a sponsor that comes and picks up the family from the camp the day that they leave. And usually that's not an issue for most camp residents, even female-headed households. I mean, this woman told me that it can be anyone, it can be a relative. So usually they didn't face any particular difficulty. But the second type of sponsorship is a lot trickier. It's needed to return to the area of origin. So you need to have either the sponsorship of local tribal authorities or of community members or both. And if you want to relocate to a third location, you have to have a solid sponsor. A lot of the people I spoke to in Genat 1 camp, they were telling me that they were hoping to go to the Kurdish region, which is in the north. And you need a solid sponsor for this. And that's where female-headed households were telling me that it was a lot more difficult for them. And as a result, many of them, and that was already the case in other camps that are now closed, but many of them end up remarrying as second or third wives, usually to local security actors, very often to someone who's in the police or someone who's powerful locally, Mukhtar, for example, a mayor of a neighborhood or a village. And many end up doing so on the condition that they leave their children behind. That's usually with the grandmother. That's a very frequent situation. Then there is a second requirement, and that's for all families with a perceived affiliation to ISIS, not just for Genat 1 camp. It's called ikhbar. It's the notification of offense. This is done in front of an investigative judge in court. It's the process whereby a person files a lawsuit, a complaint against the relative that has joined the Islamic State. It has very flimsy legal grounds in Iraqi legislation, and it serves to support prosecution to secure conviction, usually death sentences or life-term sentences. It's not mandatory to leave the camp, but security actors will ask it at checkpoints. It's also needed to return to the area of origin. It's needed to resettle in a new neighborhood. And it's also required to access civil documentation, and I'll return to that in a bit. And so it's a complaint, and women and men, first-degree relatives, have to do it, but there are additional hurdles for female-headed households. Oftentimes, they cannot afford transportation to the court. Also, it's very complicated. I mean, women are very scared to travel on their own in Iraq. And also, they need to hire lawyers at a cost of several $100s. Otherwise, it takes forever. And another difficulty, that's Iraqi law. You need two witnesses when you file a complaint to certify that the family member was ISIS. And I met a lot of women who could not complete their ikhbar procedure because they didn't have two witnesses. The problem being that even though personal status officers, they deny it because they received instruction to do so, but the issuance and the renewal of civil documentation is conditioned on ikhbar. There were instructions that were issued by the Ministry of Interior in 2017, and again in 2019. For that. And then more disturbing, in March 2021, the Federal Supreme Court of Iraq issued a decision. It's an advisory opinion, but it has a binding force. It's on the website, so it's official. So here is the translation. So it's a woman from a Tikrit. She filed a lawsuit at the Tikrit court case. It's an appeal. So at this point, it's not even about ikhbar. It's not even about the notification of offense anymore. Whether they have it or not doesn't matter anymore. Since March 2021, so this woman filed a lawsuit because she doesn't have a government-issued marriage certificate. She married under ISIS. And also, she doesn't have a proof of lineage, so a birth certificate for a child that was born after 2014 from an ISIS father, to an ISIS father, so her husband. And she filed a lawsuit against the state because she couldn't obtain the missing civil documentation. And here is part of the response of the Supreme Court. In the absence, this is very important, because it blocks completely, any child who's born after 2014 to a missing or father that's dead cannot access civil documentation. It's used as a jurisprudence. In the absence of the defendant, the father, as his whereabouts are unknown, whether or not he is dead or alive, it is extremely difficult for the plaintiff, so the female spouse, to establish a proof of marriage as well as a proof of lineage for the child born to the male defendant. Establishing lineage would necessitate sending the father with the child to do a DNA test, plus the DNA machines are broken. This is impossible for a practical point of view due to the absence of the defendant and the lack of information regarding his place of residence. In such case, the court is under the obligation to dismiss the defendant's claim. So that means that between 300,000 and 400,000 children, and that's an estimate, but maybe it's even more, born to ISIS father, dead or missing, are completely undocumented with all the security and protection concerns that are associated. And also, it means that women, spouses of ISIS members, can likewise not access civil documentation. So that places them in an extremely vulnerable positions, because corrupt lawyers might actually use this jurisprudence to offer to provide fake documentation, and that's very expensive, and some families might end up selling land that they own back in their area of origin, and that might very well be happening in Jeddah 1 as well at the moment. In any case, so all of this creates additional barriers for female-headed households. They're also more vulnerable to gender-based violence. I don't have time to enter into details, but it's the same. The risks are the same as in any other post-conflict situations, but I'll end on the note that there is an additional stigma associated with single women with children or not leaving the camp in the communities because they are perceived as sexually active and immoral. For example, to obtain certain favors from camp officials to be able to leave the camp, for example. So all of this, this perception is yet an additional risk for this woman. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Melisande, for your presentation. Very interesting. I'll hand over to Dr. Zoe Marks, who is a lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School in Public Policy. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersection of conflict and peace building, gender, racism, and inequality and African politics. You have the floor. We need Dr. Marks' slides, please. They'll be up in a second. Thank you.
I have to thank the organizers and the support crew because I sent my slides moments ago. And also thanks to Siobhan and the whole team who's behind this. It's an honor to be here and really an honor to be hosting my colleagues from Maiduguri, who I had such fun with almost a year ago to the day. It's great to have you in New York. So I'm going to be presenting some of the findings from Northeast Nigeria. I'm a political scientist with the pleasure of collaborating with the MEAC project. And I'll also be drawing on other work I've been doing for the past 15 years or so on gender and armed conflict in Africa. I'm going to take us back a couple of steps just to ensure that we're all on the same page about using a gender lens. I know that a lot of you have extensive experience with gender mainstreaming. Perhaps you've done gender-focused evidence collection. But I think there's 3 components to using a gender lens. The first is simply to train ourselves to see gender and how it manifests in different ways. And this includes looking at people as bearing gendered identities, but also roles in society and in political processes, in wartime processes, as having a gendered valence or a gendered orientation. And so that means kind of connecting the dots of where our stereotypes come from and the actual realities that we see on the ground and that people are experiencing day to day. Obviously, this applies to all of the things we've talked about thus far. Mobilization and recruitment have gendered people and gendered roles or relationships in them. Violence and victimization, I'll share some data on this, and demobilization reentry, broadly conceived. The second component to using a gender lens is really using a gendered evidence base. And this is where we've taken huge strides, but a lot of the data that's being gathered, particularly at the programmatic level, and I'm not speaking to anyone in the room, of course, is not gender disaggregated. And so that means that we don't always have access to functional gendered data and gendered breakdowns when it comes to thinking about populations that we're trying to serve, work with, respond to, or who are actually leading, I think particularly within government partners who are leading the response on the ground. They may not have up-to-date gender data. And then finally, applying gender-responsive insights in policy and programming is really just about iterating or going back and forth between seeing gender and having evidence to make smart policy adjustments and programming adjustments. So part of what's really important in doing this work is being context responsive. There are a lot of different places where we would use different language to talk about gender, and I think that we're only beginning to kind of scratch the surface on how to understand gender roles outside of the binary of male and female roles in society. It's really important to think about whether a community that we're working in is using other gendered categories, whether it matters if people are married and if that actually changes their gender identity, for instance, in the local language or local social relations. It's also important to mix qualitative and quantitative methods. So for the purposes of visual impact, I'll present some of our quantified findings, but I also want to stress that my own work in Maiduguri has been largely qualitative, and so I'm bringing these 2 methods together thanks to the kind of magic of large collaborative research projects. So without overstating the obvious, war is perceived as a masculine activity, and there's a good reason for that. Women and children historically have been kind of codified as civilians, almost regardless of what their actions have been, and so services are oriented accordingly, right? Services around conflict reduction, around peace building, tend to see men as likely combatants, and this has real harms attached to it when there's a counterinsurgency campaign and the security forces assume that men in a given region are likely combatants or a likely security threat. There's also a kind of countervailing risk that women who may be a security threat are perceived as civilians or not given resources that would be attached to the conflict operations. The fact is that men hold almost all of the command and leadership roles, not only in Northeast Nigeria across all conflict parties, but in other conflicts as well. So in cross-national data, we know that some armed groups have up to 40% female combatant participants. These tend to be left-wing rebellions that have a stated gender equality ideology. The vast majority of armed groups have much smaller rates of female frontline participation. So I have another project that's looking at the numbers of female frontline participants across armed groups from 1945 up to the present. And there we see that the vast majority of armed groups have little to no female participants at the front lines. And yet there's this significant minority of armed groups that do have large numbers of female combatants. Either way, men predominate in wielding violence and participating in frontline combat. And I say that because there's sometimes a tendency to say, but look at the women, look at the women. If we focus on a female minority, we also might miss the large majority of women in an armed group who are providing support roles. And so distinguishing between the types of functions that are required to qualify for services or to qualify for a policy is really important on the ground. Women do participate, as we've already heard, in diverse ways. There's a term called social reproduction, and it's sort of an academic feminist concept, but it simply refers to women's participation in all of the roles that are required for society to continue to survive. And so for insurgencies, particularly those in the bush that are living outside of kind of formal towns or those that are living in controlled territory, there women are often providing all of the functions in a rebel or insurgent society that they would otherwise be providing in a government-controlled society. What that means is women are being married to people, they're having children, they're taking care of one another, they're taking care of their families, they're also often producing food, they're laundering. These are devalued in society because they're not usually compensated monetarily, but they are the very thing that makes it possible for armed groups and rebellion to continue to wage violence the way that they are. Similarly, they're what makes it possible for civil defense forces, for community security apparatuses to continue to do the work that they're doing rather than to focus on other forms of care or maintenance. Women also hold a number of military roles, particularly around intelligence gathering. And in the Northeast Nigeria context, these roles wax and wane over time. And so we've seen times when a large number of the suicide bombers in Borno State and surrounding states were women and children. That was partly because they were able to move as non-militarized actors. And then that reduced. And so there are ways that gender roles are not sort of static in a conflict. So I want to just walk through a couple of the sort of gendered lenses and the actual empirical facts on the ground. Victimization is a really important space in which we begin to think about gender as we're working towards a reintegration or post-conflict rebuilding process. This slide demonstrates what non-gender disaggregated data looks like, and what's really powerful about this work, which comes from the MEAC surveys, is that it asks about people's personal experiences in orange, that's the respondent to the survey. It also asks about their close relatives and their community members. This gives us a sense of kind of exposure to social harm or how one's personal networks have been impacted by conflict. A conflict-affected community is going to have people who are exposed to conflict and harm regardless of their gender, right? So conflict impacts all of us. Almost all people in the Northeast, in Maiduguri specifically, have lost friends or relatives or neighbors as a result of the conflict. Many people have been displaced. The vast majority, in surveys I've done in Yobe and surveys that MEAC has done in Borno State, the vast majority of people have experienced displacement at some point. And that's regardless of gender. But when we move into a gendered breakdown, this comes from personal data because I didn't have the MEAC graphs this morning. But the MEAC graphs will also be released soon, I think. Gendered victimization patterns are really quite different. And so overwhelmingly, and this is true in Northeast Nigeria, but across conflicts, men and boys are much more likely to experience direct physical violence, or what you might think of as militarized attacks. They're more likely to be injured in battle. They're more likely to be shot. They're more likely to be killed. Women and girls are more likely to experience sexual violence, although there's a large silence around the sexual violence that men and boys experience, particularly in conflict-related detention. And then finally, in Northeast Nigeria, we see that women and children are more likely to be displaced for the long term. And these are sort of margins that are varied from conflict to conflict, but as Melisande was also just talking about in Iraq, you have large numbers of women and children who've been displaced into camps. And so when we think about this, we can think about how we organize our responses to different types of harms in a gender-sensitive or gender-responsive way. The gendered experience of victimization may also be impacting how communities receive returnees from conflict groups and from armed groups. And so some of the most interesting, from my perspective, findings that have come out of the MEAC study and other studies that I've done, along with Rebecca Littman, who we heard from yesterday, is around a gender gap in community acceptance. Now, I say this as some of the most interesting findings because I actually didn't expect to find this, despite working on gender and conflict for over 15 years. What we see is that women are significantly and persistently less welcoming of former conflict affiliates, specifically Boko Haram and ISWAP affiliates in this case. to come back into the community. Now, community receptivity is very, very high in Northeast Nigeria. It's over 60, 70%. It's increasing towards 80%, particularly as people have more information about specific cases or hypothetical cases of returnees. But when we asked people both whether they would accept a woman who had been with Boko Haram returning to the community or whether they would accept a man who had been with Boko Haram returning to the community, you can see that the male respondents in blue have basically a 10 percentage point or more higher acceptance rate than women community members in orange. Both the majority of men and the majority of women would accept a returnee, but they're quite significant and persistent gaps here. There are also gaps in anger and fear according to gender. And this is not according to the gender of the returnee. In fact, that's relatively stable, but the gender of the respondent or the community member. Women feel more anger towards men and women with Boko Haram. They're more afraid of them. And this is largely due to them perceiving a greater threat or risk of them inflicting recurrent harm in the community. Part of what's going on here is also the social context of gender. And so women have much less access to power brokers, and to the information that revolves around in the public sphere than men do. And this is because of a male-dominated public sphere in the region. Most men have spoken to a local leader or an imam in the past week. Most women, it's the past year or never. And similarly, women don't have as much information about reentry processes, but when given that information, they become as accepting as men or closer to it. So I just want to close on a quote from a woman who we'll call Aisha, who escaped on foot from Boko Haram. Her story is like many of the women that I've talked to and that my colleagues have talked to. They've talked to thousands more. She says that my husband went through the return process, Operation Safe Corridor, and received money. And she actually didn't know how much money he'd received because he held it. But I, with my 5 children, received nothing. They didn't even have shoes on their feet when we came out. To this day, I'm not in contact with him. And she escaped on foot with 5 children. Other women escaped not only with their own children, but the children of other women who will follow. And the challenge that we're faced with is that resources exiting conflict are tied to perceived conflict risk. They're tied to the perceived risk of harm, which of course is going to be masculine if men are controlling and wielding most of the violence in a war zone. So in short, violent men get stipends, but self-reintegrated women and children in particular get nothing. It seems that the vast majority of women and children are self-reintegrated, largely due to the limited capacity of camps and the kind of confusing exit pathways. And they, of course, should not be tied to fighters or family units in cases of coercion. So I have a memorable story from a focus group where I asked the women if they would ever divorce their husbands, and they all said no. And I said, what if you could do anything in the world and no one would know? And they all laughed and said, obviously everyone would divorce their husband. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that as we try to bake choice into different pathways to empowerment, into healing, we need to remember that choices are always socially constrained, and to respond to social constraints is a way to provide more caring exit options that are not just tailored to individuals who can act in a vacuum, but rather individuals who have real lives and real families that they want to maintain their connection to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zoe, for that very comprehensive tour through a whole DDR cycle with a gender lens. Thank you. I will now hand over to Dr. Aleksandra Dier, who is the gender coordinator at CTED, that's the UN Security Council Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. She was previously the regional advisor and head of peace, security, and humanitarian action at the UN Women Regional Office in Cairo, and served in UN field missions in Afghanistan and Burundi before, as well as in different positions at UNHQ. Thank you so much. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and big congratulations to Siobhan and the whole MEAC team for really this excellent project, and I think a really interesting and fruitful discussions over the past couple of days, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. I think at the outset, let me just say, I think it's great that we have this dedicated panel on issues pertaining to the particular roles of women and gender considerations as they pertain to exiting from armed groups. I think it's important to highlight, though, that these issues around gender and women's roles have also come up throughout our discussions over the past 2 days, and it is really important to not just silo off that issue and ensure that when we think about about the challenges that we are dealing with, that we think of gender as an integral part of that. I think just to reiterate what we've already heard from Dr. Marks, also on the issue of not thinking of gender as just equaling women, but that it is really an analytical lens that we are applying, and that it is that looking from a gender perspective is something that should be applied to people of all genders in that context. Now, I will be focusing predominantly on some of the observations that pertain to violent extremist groups or UN-listed groups, if that's the preferred term. But I think many of these considerations apply also to other types of armed groups. My comments are really based on some of the information that we have gathered from CTED's analysis, assessments, as well as our direct engagement with different member states on these issues. The first thing that I want to say right at the outset, which is a major challenge that we continue to encounter whenever we raise these issues with different member states and practitioners on the ground, which is the fact that, you know, we have all this guidance that says you have to make these interventions gender sensitive. And practitioners on the ground simply do not know what that actually means. And how do you design these programs and initiatives in such a way that they are actually gender sensitive? So I think that it is really important to try and move beyond some of the sort of generic guidance and some of the buzzwords, and really be able to articulate in very concrete, practical, and real-life terms what it actually means to include gender perspectives throughout the full cycle of interventions that we're looking at here. And so what I will try to do is perhaps provide some of the examples that have come to our attention where gender issues are relevant, have been, however, neglected, or where there are challenges in actual implementation of gender-sensitive policies and programming. And that really is sort of, again, across the full cycle and the full spectrum of issues that we're looking at here. Starting with what I think is very important and came out very nicely in the framing of this whole workshop is as a starting point, really, the pathways into armed groups and the specific journeys of women and girls in that regard. And I think one of the issues that comes out quite clearly in that context is that not only, but especially when dealing with women, the lines between victims and perpetrators are often blurred. And that not only means that it is hard to ascertain whether they are one or the other, but that in many cases they're actually both at the same time. And that is something that has then very important implications for how we address their particular situation. For example, very concretely, if we are dealing with cases of individuals who have been victims of human trafficking, that has real implications in terms of how they ought to be dealt with. For example, it means that any criminal acts that resulted directly from their having been trafficked is something that they should not be prosecuted for. And that is something that means we have to have proper screening and proper assessment that takes into account and is able to, again, establish whether or not we are dealing with a case of human trafficking or not. However, again, that means those individuals, officials, or whoever the authorities are who are conducting these types of screenings, assessments, and investigations have to have the expertise and the training to know how to actually establish these facts and how to do so in a way that is sensitive to the needs of the victim concerned. Now, yesterday we talked a bit about issues around justice and accountability. So I want to maybe say a few quick words about the issue of prosecutions of women, which again, in the context of violent extremism, is something that we look at and that we have conducted some dedicated analysis on. that really showed that there is gender bias and gendered challenges in the prosecutorial process, really, again, from beginning to end, from the types of decisions that pertain to the charges, that pertain to sentencing, that pertain to the kind of support that convicted individuals receive in the prison system. So what we have seen is that the vast majority of women, that is not dissimilar also from men, but the vast majority of women, even more so, are being charged with membership crimes of violent extremist groups. This is partly due to the type of legislation that we have that is often extremely vague and overbroad. But at the same time, it does relate in a gendered way to the issue that you also touched on extensively in terms of the very complex and diverse roles that women play in these groups, and that it is often particularly difficult to have evidence and to establish exactly what their roles have been and whether those roles have been violent, non-violent, whether these roles or their actions constitute a crime or not, or are other types of support roles, and what to do in such cases. When it comes to sentencing as well, we have seen differences across member states, and we have kind of seen both ends of the spectrum. We have seen, on the one hand, a tendency to treat women sometimes with greater leniency, and in other cases, we have seen them being punished particularly harshly. Again, on the basis of charges of association and membership without actually establishing any particular violent criminal conduct. And in the case of Iraq, we have had women receiving life sentences and death penalty for membership charges, which were essentially, they were the female relatives of male fighters. Very briefly, on the issue, just to finish on the issue of sort of the criminal justice side and accountability, I do want to highlight that if we're looking at that from a gendered perspective, that does not only mean looking at the prosecutions of women. It also means looking at accountability for sexual and gender-based violence crimes, and of which women and girls are, of course, disproportionately the victims. But we do also have complete impunity for SGBV in the context of, or directed against, members of the LGBTQ community, as well as male victims of sexual violence perpetrated by violent extremist groups. Very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, moving on beyond sort of the criminal justice and accountability space, but to reintegration. We've already heard a number of very good and concrete examples of the types of barriers that women face within their communities, within society. I do want to highlight that we have also seen that many of the types of programs and support initiatives that are being provided to them in the reintegration context also do suffer from gender bias. For example, we have seen that women are much less likely to receive the kind of vocational training and support that would enable them to earn their own livelihood subsequently compared to men. And again, that is something that seems to be based on a certain gendered bias and gender perception of their role. And this is despite the fact that we have such a large number of female-headed households. So another important issue to rectify. I'm getting reminders of time, so I will skip over a few of the other points that have already been raised around the different types of stigmatization, and again, gendered stigmatization that is experienced. I do want to say, just very briefly, that again, these sort of gendered stereotypes do apply both to men and women in different ways, and we have seen particular challenges that again manifest themselves in very concrete ways when it comes to assumptions around men and adolescent boys being predominantly seen through the lens of posing a threat, and we see what that does to, for example, repatriation efforts in the case of the camps in Iraq and northeastern Syria. I will finish on just one final point, which I think is a very central one, of course, to this entire project, which is the issue of evidence. And just to highlight that in the area of gender and including gender considerations, that is really something where we have an enormous gap. And where we don't just need more gender disaggregated data, but we also need much more robust and systematic monitoring and evaluation of the gendered impacts of the various initiatives and programs that are being implemented in the area of reintegration. And that is really the only way to avoid the types of gendered harms that I was outlining. So I will stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aleksandra, for providing us with very concrete examples of applying, again, a gender lens to processes with those associated with violent extremist groups, and I think also ending on that very important point of data and monitoring. With this, I will hand over to our discussant on today's panel, Dieng, who is a senior DDR and PRR advisor at the UNDP Crisis Bureau. He has extensive experience in demobilization and reintegration of ex-combatants, as well as security sector governance issues, managed several DDR and SSR assistant programs, and led on strategic processes, participated in the design and delivery of many capacity development tools and training modules, and is an expert in the field, clearly. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the privileged position I'm in right now, sitting in this panel. This is the kind of representation we would like to see, gender representation we would like to see in the field, across the board, from planning all the way to monitoring and evaluation when we're dealing with gender and SSR. So I think we need more women representation, more women presence, more women voice, make them a little more visible and less vulnerable. So I think if we could just have this paradigm shift, transfer this same representation in the field to bring more voice, a greater voice, or women voice and girls' voice in our work, I think it, on the demand side, it would make a great difference. Well, we've heard lots of information here that are extremely valuable, and I think one of the common denominator here has to do with the fact that things probably on the women's side, on women's support, have not changed much. Last year I was in the DRC as a coordinator for a regional security cooperation mechanism involving 5 countries. It was in 2022, 20 years after my first encounter with the DRC on the same issues, dealing with DDR, dealing with foreign armed groups, the present foreign armed groups. And when we look at the situation of women associated with those armed groups, the problems are still there. Meanwhile, there's been a lot of work that has been done. We all here around in this room have been contributing to, in fact, improving both on the theoretical side, but also practically on the ground. So the problem are still there, although there's still hope that things will get better from what we've heard today. When it comes to obstacle to return, for instance, that was presented, the same problem come back when it comes to the requirements for the return. These are hurdles, additional hurdles to that are a little bit more salient when it comes to women return and repatriation. The question of acceptance of return that was also raised, the victimization and all, those are critical issues that we still find in different parts of, in different DDR program, in different settings. And the gender bias in prosecution that was mentioned also is an additional barrier. So in all these points, I just would like to mention first that, of course, UNDP has been involved, as you may know, on the capacity development issue in collaboration with other UN entities and other, to developing how-to knowledge, improving lessons learned, sharing knowledge, but also in its research has worked on, the hidden women. How can we make them a little bit more visible? How can we work on like the dimension, the violence dimension of women involvement in several of these conflict around the world. Now, I would like just to listening to all that has been said today, come back to the 3 V's that I mentioned earlier in terms of visibility, the voice, and also the vulnerability. Just to give you one of the examples, for instance, of in our action in Liberia, where with the alert, I think somebody alluded to it earlier, women are also actors of violence. We've seen that there were women commandos that we call the WAC in Liberia back then with the alert, the Liberian United Reconciliation and Democracy Group, where women also was showing that they could do more than men by just being present and being violent. But oftentimes, when we are addressing those issues, the response are targeting only men and boys that are carrying weapons. So I think this is something that we should be paying more attention in the future. In Sudan, for instance, there's another example about social reintegration for women, addressing the psychological accept in the Blue Nile. And in that example, for instance, they were targeting only women that were associated with the armed groups, and undermining the fact that in that community also there are other women that needed the same kind of support. There are also other male that also have the same level of trauma. So when we're addressing all these issues, we have to have a very thorough assessment of the entire community and see on both sides gender that they also need this kind of assistance. I just would like to stress quickly the fact that there is the weight of social and cultural constraints on women as well that needs to be stressed. I think this is something that might have transpired from the different presentations, but there are places where, of course, because women are less visible, if there are limited resources, the privilege will be given to boys and men first. If there's a transport issue, as you were explaining earlier, for instance, for women, because they cannot pay for their own transport, or they won't have the resources to pay for a lawyer or anything, if resources are limited, they will first transport male and boys, because of course they have greater visibility, because all the projects are targeted first with that bias that were mentioned in the beginning, that the programs have been designed, the TDR program generally have been designed just to address male combatants and boys. So I think it's our collective responsibility to come up with more, I would say, hands-on responses. Yesterday, somebody was saying here in this room that it's a practice that should, in fact, design the research and the theoretical part, not necessarily only theory being sort of immediately implemented on the ground without the evidence-based experience that some of you have brilliantly presented here. So I would like to just wrap up by just sharing the question I've been asking myself when it comes to gender and DDR for a long time. Is gender a supply-driven sort of, I would say, response? The inclusion of gender in and women participation in our DDR, is it really supply-driven or demand-driven, in a way that oftentimes, even when we design the best program, when we design the best responses, somehow the problems are on the ground. Do they really have the capacity and the political will and collectively on the ground, to work together and make sure that the responses that we're providing are own and ready to be implemented? So that's the other side of demand-driven versus gender-driven approaches. Well, thank you. I'll stop right here.
Thank you very much for bringing all of this together and wrapping up our panel session. I think we were provided with an extreme amount of food for thought, but not just for thought, but discussion. And you will have the opportunity to, I think after a short coffee break, move into our discussion and workshop rooms. Ellie will facilitate the workshop on this very panel, and I would like to thank you all.
Can I just add something very quickly? So, I'm just a researcher. Most of the time I'm in Iraq. I'm meeting only low-level humanitarian workers, but I would like really today to take the opportunity to beg you, this jurisprudence that I mentioned, there needs to be not only strong advocacy, but pressure exerted on the Iraqi government, and they have to remove this. We're talking about a state officially denying citizenship to hundreds of thousands of its children and women. This is terrible. This is huge. And of course, there is no strict determinism, but this, be assured that you are throwing hundreds of thousands of people back into the arms of the next insurgency. I'm telling you, I'm begging you today, do something, please.
Thank you, Melisande, for your last passionate words. Well noted. Thank you.